Elena Matthews stepped out of her sleek black car and looked up at the small brick building with the Pinnacle Financial sign hanging above the entrance. The morning sun reflected off the windows, giving the place a warm glow that didn't match the butterflies in her stomach. Today wasn't a normal day for her. As the CEO of Pinnacle Financial Group, she usually walked into buildings with people rushing to open doors for her. Not today. Today, she was just Eleanor. She had swapped her usual designer suit for jeans, a simple blouse, and a light jacket. Her hair was pulled back in a plain ponytail instead of the perfect styling her assistant usually arranged. Even her luxury watch was sitting in a drawer at home, replaced by a simple band she'd bought years ago. "Time to see how things really work," she whispered to herself. 3 months ago, Pinnacle had bought out Regional Trust Bank, adding 15 branches to their network. The papers called it a seamless integration, but Eleanor knew better. Numbers on reports only told part of the story. She needed to see the truth with her own eyes. The Westbrook branch was the smallest of the new additions, tucked away in a neighborhood that still had family-owned shops instead of big chains. Elena had picked it randomly from the list, deciding it would give her the most honest picture of how things were going. As she pushed open the heavy glass door, the smell of cleaning products and old carpet hit her nose. The inside looked exactly like the photos in the acquisition report: beige walls, dark wood counters, and chairs that had seen better days 10 years ago. 4 tellers stood behind the counter, though only 2 were helping customers. A security guard nodded at her from his post near the entrance. Eleanor took a deep breath and joined the short line. She had practiced her story on the drive over. Her sister needed emergency money for car repairs, and Eleanor needed to withdraw $5,000 in cash. A simple transaction that any bank should handle easily, especially for a client with her account balance. The line moved slowly as an older man at the front argued about a fee on his statement. Elena watched how the teller handled the situation, noticing how the young man's eyes kept darting to his manager for help. Not a good sign. When it was finally her turn, Elena stepped up to the counter with a friendly smile. The teller, a thin man with glasses that kept slipping down his nose, barely looked up from his computer screen. "How can I help you?" he asked, his tone making it clear he wasn't actually interested in helping. "I need to make a withdrawal, please." Elena handed over her ID and account information. The teller, whose name had read Robert, typed her information with surprising speed. His eyebrows raised slightly as her account details appeared on his screen. Elena knew what he was seeing: an account with a 7-figure balance that had been transferred from Pinnacle's main system after the merger. "You want to withdraw? How much?" he asked, suddenly paying much more attention to her. $5,000, please, in hundreds if possible." Robert's mouth tightened. "That's a large cash withdrawal, ma'am. Do you have an appointment?" Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "An appointment? I've never needed one before." "Well, at this branch, we require notice for withdrawals over $3,000. It's policy." His voice had taken on that special tone people use when they're making up rules as they go. "That's interesting," Eleanor said, keeping her voice pleasant. "Because Pinnacle Financial's policy allows cash withdrawals up to $10,000 without prior notice. And since this is a Pinnacle branch now..." Robert's face flushed red. He turned and whispered something to the woman at the desk behind him. She looked up, annoyance clear on her face, and made her way to the counter. Little did they know, the woman in simple clothes standing before them held the power to change their entire world with a single phone call. The woman who approached the counter had perfectly styled hair and a navy pantsuit that screamed authority. Her name had read Mrs. Thompson, with branch manager in smaller letters underneath. She looked Eleanor up and down, her eyes lingering on the scuffed edges of Eleanor's purse, a deliberate choice Eleanor had made that morning when planning her disguise. "Is there a problem here, Robert?" Mrs. Thompson asked, though her eyes never left Eleanor. "This lady wants to withdraw $5,000 without prior notice," Robert explained, emphasizing the amount as if it were outrageous. Mrs. Thompson's painted-on smile didn't reach her eyes. "I'm afraid that won't be possible today. For security reasons, we require 48 hours notice for any cash withdrawal over $3,000. She spoke slowly, the way people do when they think you might not understand basic concepts. Eleanor maintained her composure, though she could feel heat rising in her cheeks. That's interesting because Pinnacle Financial's official policy allows for withdrawals up to $10,000 without prior notice. I've done it many times at other branches. Mrs. Thompson's smile tightened. Well, perhaps they were breaking protocol. Here at Westbrook, we take security very seriously. She slid Eleanor's ID back across the counter. You can fill out a withdrawal request form, and we'll have your cash ready in 2 business days. Eleanor picked up her ID, taking a slow breath. I understand security concerns, but my account balance clearly shows I have the funds. This is an emergency situation. Everyone has emergencies, ma'am. Mrs. Thompson's voice dripped with condescension. That's why we suggest keeping adequate funds in your checking account for immediate needs. A few people in line behind Eleanor were starting to shift impatiently. An older woman whispered something to her husband, who nodded sympathetically in Eleanor's direction. Look, Eleanor said, lowering her voice, I don't want to create a scene, but I'm actually Eleanor Matthews. I'm the CEO of Pinnacle Financial Group. She hadn't planned to reveal herself, but this rejection was worse than she'd anticipated. Mrs. Thompson's eyebrows shot up, then she let out a short, sharp laugh that turned heads throughout the lobby. Oh my goodness, she said loudly, making no attempt to be discreet. Robert, did you hear that? This lady claims she's the CEO. The security guard by the door straightened up, suddenly alert to the situation. Robert looked deeply uncomfortable, glancing between his manager and Eleanor. Mrs. Thompson leaned forward, her voice now theatrical. If you're Eleanor Matthews, then I'm the Queen of England. Do you think we don't know what our own CEO looks like? Her photo is literally on our website and in the break room. Eleanor's face burned as every eye in the bank turned toward her. A younger woman waiting in line had even pulled out her phone, clearly ready to record if things escalated. Mrs. Thompson, Eleanor said quietly, this is highly unprofessional. All I'm asking is to withdraw my own money. What's unprofessional is trying to bypass security protocols with ridiculous claims. Mrs. Thompson gestured to the door. Now, you can either fill out the withdrawal request form for processing, or you can leave and come back in 2 days. Your choice. Eleanor took another deep breath, then slipped her ID back into her wallet. I see. Thank you for your time. You're welcome, Mrs. Thompson said with fake sweetness. And next time, maybe don't pretend to be someone important just to get special treatment. We serve everyone equally here. As Eleanor turned to leave, she caught Robert mouthing sorry when his manager wasn't looking. The security guard held the door open for her, his face carefully neutral. Outside, the warm morning sun felt mockingly cheerful. Eleanor walked calmly to her car, her mind racing with thoughts. She had expected to find some issues during her visit, maybe slow service or outdated procedures, but this level of customer disrespect was shocking. She sat in her car for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel. This wasn't just about her wounded pride or the inconvenience. It was about a fundamental failure in the system she was responsible for. Equally bad service for everyone isn't equality, she murmured to herself as she started the engine. It's just bad service. Instead of feeling defeated, Eleanor felt a new determination taking hold. This branch needed more than a memo or a training session. It needed a complete overhaul, and she knew exactly where to start. Eleanor drove straight to Pinnacle's headquarters, her mind racing with plans. The sleek glass building towered over the financial district, a far cry from the worn carpet and outdated furniture of the Westbrook branch. As she pulled into her reserved parking spot, she caught her reflection in the rearview mirror and almost laughed. She still looked like someone who'd been told she couldn't access her own money. The security guard at the front desk did a double take as she walked in wearing jeans instead of her usual business attire. Good morning, Miss Matthews, he said, recovering quickly. Casual Friday came early this week. Just a little undercover work, Tim, she replied with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. In the elevator, Eleanor pulled her hair out of its ponytail and shook it loose. By the time she reached the executive floor, she had switched mental gears from humiliated customer to CEO on a mission. Her assistant, Diane, nearly spilled her coffee when Eleanor walked in. I thought you were taking the morning off, she said, eyes wide at Eleanor's unusual appearance. Change of plans. I need to see all customer satisfaction reports from the acquired regional trust branches for the past 3 months, and cancel my afternoon meetings. Within an hour, Eleanor was surrounded by reports, charts, and customer feedback forms. The numbers painted a clear picture. The Westbrook branch had the lowest customer satisfaction scores of all 15 acquired locations. Complaints about unfriendly staff, arbitrary rules, and poor service filled the comment sections. Eleanor reached for her phone. "Get me Harriet from operations, Lee from customer experience, and Bill from HR. I need them in my office in 30 minutes. While waiting, she pulled up the personnel files for the Westbrook branch. Mrs. Thompson, Patricia Thompson, had been with Regional Trust for 15 years. Her performance reviews were technically satisfactory, but reading between the lines, Eleanor saw a pattern: rigid adherence to rules, resistance to change, and a management style that prioritized control over customer service. Robert Chen, the teller who had first assisted her, was relatively new, only 8 months on the job. His previous performance reviews showed promise, but his customer service scores had slowly declined since Mrs. Thompson became his manager. By the time Eleanor's 3 executives arrived at her office, she had the beginnings of a plan. They looked confused by her casual attire, but she didn't waste time explaining. "I just experienced the worst customer service of my life," she began, "at our own bank." She described her visit to the Westbrook branch, not sparing any details of her humiliation. Lee, the customer experience director, looked horrified. "They actually laughed when you said you were the CEO." Loudly and publicly, Eleanor confirmed. "But this isn't about my bruised ego. It's about a toxic branch culture that's hurting our customers and our reputation." Harriet from operations pulled out her tablet. "Westbrook's numbers have been concerning. Their transaction times are 30% longer than our standard, and they're processing fewer loans than comparable branches. Their staff turnover is high too," Bill from HR added. 3 tellers have quit in the past 2 months. Eleanor stood up and walked to the window overlooking the city. "This branch represents everything our company isn't supposed to be. The acquisition was meant to bring better service to those communities, not worse." She turned back to face her team. "I want a 3-pronged approach. First, an emergency audit tomorrow morning. I want to see every policy violation, every customer interaction, everything." Harriet nodded, already taking notes. "Second, I want a complete review of every employee at that branch, with special attention to management practices." Bill gave a thumbs up. "I'll handle that personally." And third, Eleanor said, her voice growing more determined, "I want a retraining program ready to implement immediately. Not just customer service basics, but a complete reorientation to what banking should be." "Do you want to replace the staff?" Lee asked carefully. Eleanor thought about Robert's apologetic face and the customers waiting patiently in line. "No, not yet. This isn't just about punishing bad behavior. It's about fixing a broken culture. We bought these branches because we believed in their potential. Now it's time to help them reach it." As her team left to prepare, Eleanor looked down at her casual clothes once more. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, she would remind the Westbrook branch exactly who she was and what her bank stood for. The next morning, the Westbrook branch opened its doors at 9:00 a.m. as usual. What wasn't usual were the 4 people who entered right after the security guard unlocked the entrance. They wore business casual clothing and carried tablets, moving with quiet purpose as they took positions throughout the lobby. Mrs. Thompson emerged from her office at 9:15, frowning when she spotted the strangers. One woman was sitting in the waiting area, seemingly filling out a deposit slip, but actually documenting how long customers waited in line. A man in khakis stood near the pamphlet display, discreetly recording a teller who had been on her phone instead of helping an elderly customer. "Excuse me," Mrs. Thompson approached the nearest visitor, a woman in her 40s making notes on a tablet. "Can I help you?" The woman smiled pleasantly. "No, thank you. We're just conducting a routine assessment." She handed Mrs. Thompson a business card that read Pinnacle Financial Group, Quality Assurance Team. Mrs. Thompson's smile froze. "I wasn't informed about any assessment today." "That's by design," the woman replied calmly. "Surprise visits give us the most accurate picture." As the morning progressed, the audit team blended into the background, becoming almost invisible as they observed every interaction, every transaction, every policy being implemented, all misinterpreted. They asked casual questions of waiting customers who were all too happy to share their banking experiences. "The tellers are nice enough," one man told an auditor, "but everything takes forever here. At the downtown branch, I'm in and out in 10 minutes." A young woman complained about being charged fees that didn't exist at other branches. An older gentleman described how he'd been forced to make 3 separate trips to open a simple savings account because the rules kept changing. By lunchtime, the audit team had filled dozens of pages with notes. 2 of them slipped into the break room during the lunch hour, noting how staff complained about those people from headquarters and impossible standards. Meanwhile, back at Pinnacle's main office, Elena sat with Bill from HR, reviewing personnel files more thoroughly. "It's worse than we thought," Bill said, sliding a folder across the desk. "Mrs. Thompson has had multiple complaints from employees over the years. Regional Trust kept burying them." Elena flipped through the documentation. 3 formal complaints about creating a hostile work environment in the last 2 years alone. "And look at this," Bill pointed to a performance review. Her previous supervisor noted her strict interpretation of policies as a positive trait. Because Regional Trust valued compliance over customer satisfaction, Elena said, "That's exactly the culture we need to change." She turned to Robert's file next. His initial hiring assessment showed high scores for empathy and problem-solving. His first 6 months had glowing reviews until Mrs. Thompson became his direct supervisor. "He's not the problem," Elena said. "He's a symptom." Back at the branch, the afternoon brought more revelations. An auditor observed Mrs. Thompson refusing to help a small business owner deposit his weekly earnings because he had too many coins. Another watched Robert get reprimanded for spending too much time helping an elderly woman understand her statement. At 3:30 p.m., the team's leader sent a text message to Elena, "Documentation complete, 27 policy violations observed, 17 directly traceable to management instructions." Elena replied immediately, "Prepare the conference room. We'll be there at noon tomorrow." That evening, Eleanor met with her executive team to review the audit findings. The results were unanimous. The Westbrook branch was failing its customers, and the root cause was a management style completely at odds with Pinnacle's values. "So what's the plan?" Lee asked. "Do we shut it down? Transfer everyone?" Eleanor shook her head. "No, tomorrow we're going to teach them what banking should be about." She pulled out a notebook where she'd been sketching ideas all day. "I want a complete transformation. New training, new layout, new approach. And it starts with showing them exactly what they've been doing wrong." As her team nodded in agreement, Elena felt a mix of determination and anticipation. Tomorrow wouldn't just be about confronting Mrs. Thompson. It would be about redefining what her bank stood for, one branch at a time. "Have the conference room ready by 11:30, she told her assistant, "and make sure my suit is pressed. Tomorrow, there will be no question about who's in charge." At exactly noon the next day, a sleek black car pulled up in front of the Westbrook branch. The driver opened the rear door, and Elena stepped out, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. Behind her, 3 executives emerged from a second car. They looked serious, focused, and completely out of place in the small neighborhood branch. Inside, the morning had been tense. The audit team had returned, this time openly taking notes and asking questions. Mrs. Thompson had called her regional director twice, but strangely, he wasn't answering his phone. When Eleanor walked through the front doors, the entire lobby fell silent. A customer who had been complaining about a fee suddenly stopped mid-sentence. The security guard's eyes widened in recognition. At the counter, Robert froze, a stack of deposit slips forgotten in his hands. Mrs. Thompson was speaking to a teller, her back to the entrance. When she noticed everyone staring, she turned around. The color drained from her face as she recognized Eleanor, not as the casual customer from 2 days ago, but as the woman whose portrait hung in the break room labeled Eleanor Matthews, CEO. "Good afternoon," Eleanor said pleasantly, her voice carrying across the quiet lobby. "I believe we've met before." Mrs. Thompson's mouth opened and closed, no words coming out. Behind her, Robert looked like he wanted to disappear. "I'd like to speak with all staff in the conference room, please," Eleanor continued. Immediately, one of the executives stepped forward to handle the customers, explaining there would be a brief staff meeting and offering them coffee and pastries that had been brought in for the occasion. In the small conference room at the back of the branch, the entire staff gathered: 6 tellers, 2 loan officers, the security guard, and Mrs. Thompson. Elena stood at the head of the table, her executive team beside her. "For those who don't recognize me, I'm Eleanor Matthews, CEO of Pinnacle Financial Group." Her voice was calm but carried unmistakable authority. "2 days ago, I came into this branch as a regular customer. I wanted to withdraw $5,000 from my account, a simple transaction that should have taken less than 5 minutes." She glanced at Mrs. Thompson, whose face had now flushed deep red. "Instead, I was told that wasn't possible. I was told Pinnacle had policies that don't actually exist. When I identified myself, I was publicly humiliated and laughed at by management." The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. "But this isn't about me or my wounded pride." Eleanor motioned to one of her team members, who set up a tablet to project onto the wall. "This is about what's happening in this branch every single day." The projection showed video clips from the previous day's audit. An elderly man being rushed through a transaction before he could ask questions, a small business owner being treated dismissively because of his coin deposit, Robert getting scolded for being too helpful to a customer. "Our policies exist to protect our customers, not to humiliate them," Eleanor said. "Every rule we have is designed to make banking easier, not harder." She turned to Mrs. Thompson. "The policy you cited about large withdrawals, it doesn't exist. Pinnacle customers can withdraw up to $10,000 cash without notice at any branch, anytime." Mrs. Thompson stared at the floor. "The way you spoke to me, to your customers, that's not what Pinnacle stands for." Eleanor's voice softened slightly. "Banking isn't about rules and power. It's about trust. People trust us with their money, their dreams, their futures. And in return, we owe them respect and support." Eleanor looked around the room, making eye contact with each staff member. "I'm not here to fire anyone. I'm here because I believe this branch can be better." She nodded to the HR director, who handed out folders to everyone. "Starting tomorrow, this branch is going to change. We're going to retrain, reorganize, and rebuild. Every single policy will be reviewed. Every customer interaction will be improved." To everyone's surprise, Eleanor walked over to Robert and put a hand on his shoulder. "I saw how uncomfortable you were with how I was treated. That tells me you understand what good service should look like." She turned back to the whole room. "This isn't a punishment, it's an opportunity. We can make this the best branch in our network, but only if everyone commits to change." As she finished speaking, Eleanor looked directly at Mrs. Thompson, whose expression had shifted from embarrassment to something more complex, perhaps the first stirrings of understanding that a different approach might actually be possible. The Westbrook branch didn't open to customers the next morning. Instead, the staff arrived to find the furniture rearranged, the old posters replaced with new ones, and a breakfast spread waiting in the conference room. Elena stood at the front, not in her power suit from yesterday, but in business casual attire that matched what she asked everyone to wear. "Today is day 1 of our transformation," she announced once everyone had settled with coffee and breakfast. "We're going to rebuild this branch from the inside out." The training started immediately. Elena didn't bring in outside consultants. She led many of the sessions herself. She walked the tellers through real-world scenarios, showing them how to handle difficult situations with empathy rather than rigid rules. "The customer who's upset about a fee isn't angry about the money," she explained. "They're angry because they feel powerless. Our job is to give them back some control." Mrs. Thompson sat stiffly in the back row during the first session, arms crossed and lips pressed tightly together. By lunchtime, she had started taking notes. By the end of the day, she had asked her first hesitant question. The physical transformation of the branch happened simultaneously. The imposing counter that separated staff from customers was replaced with open desk areas. The dark, outdated furniture gave way to comfortable seating arranged in small groups. Even the lighting changed, with harsh fluorescence swapped for warmer fixtures that made the space feel welcoming. "Banking shouldn't feel like going to the dentist," Eleanor told them. It should feel like visiting a trusted advisor. Rather than firing Mrs. Thompson as everyone expected, Eleanor paired her with a mentor, a branch manager from downtown who had turned around his own struggling location. The first meeting between them was tense, with Mrs. Thompson defensive about her methods. "I've always followed the rules," she insisted. "I've done everything by the book." "The problem," her mentor replied gently, "is that you've been following the wrong book." Eleanor gave Mrs. Thompson 60 days to demonstrate improvement. "I don't expect perfection," she said during their private meeting. "I expect progress. Show me you can put customers first, and there's a place for you here." With Robert, Eleanor took a different approach. She recognized his potential and spent time coaching him personally. She showed him how to balance efficiency with empathy, how to bend policies without breaking them, how to make customers feel valued in every interaction. "You knew something was wrong with how I was treated," she told him. "Trust that instinct. It will make you an exceptional banker." The transformation wasn't without challenges. 2 tellers quit during the first week, unable or unwilling to adapt to the new expectations. A few customers, accustomed to the old ways, were confused by the changes. But slowly, day by day, the branch began to shift. Eleanor instituted a new program she called CEO Shadow, where branch managers from across the network would spend a week at headquarters, observing executive meetings and understanding the company's vision firsthand. Mrs. Thompson was scheduled for the 3rd rotation, an assignment that surprised everyone, including Mrs. Thompson herself. "Why me?" she asked Eleanor when she received the invitation. "After what happened?" "Because you have 15 years of experience," Eleanor replied. "If you can channel that knowledge in the right direction, you could be one of our most valuable leaders." By the end of the first month, customer complaints had dropped by 40%. By the end of the second month, transaction times had decreased while customer satisfaction scores had risen. Staff started to smile more, laugh more, work together more effectively. The most surprising change came from Mrs. Thompson. The woman who had once rigidly enforced outdated rules began to ask questions. How can we make this easier for customers? What would make their experience better? Her transformation wasn't overnight. She still struggled with flexibility, still sometimes fell back on "that's just policy," but she was trying. And in Eleanor's eyes, that effort mattered. 6 weeks after the confrontation, Eleanor visited the branch again. This time she didn't come in disguise. She walked in the front door, greeted by name by the security guard, and smiled at the changes she saw all around her. The true test would come soon, but already she could feel the difference in the air. The branch had become what she had always envisioned banking could be. 6 months after the day Eleanor was denied her own money, she stood on a small stage set up in Pinnacle's main conference center. Before her sat 200 branch managers and executives gathered for the company's annual leadership meeting. Behind her, a large screen displayed a simple message: "The Customer Experience Revolution." "I want to tell you a story," Eleanor began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "A story about the day I couldn't withdraw my own money from my own bank." Laughter rippled through the audience as Eleanor recounted her experience at the Westbrook branch, now told with enough distance to find the humor in it. She described her shock, her embarrassment, and finally, her realization. "It was the most valuable rejection I've ever experienced," she said, "because it showed me something I might never have seen from my office on the top floor." The screen behind her changed to show customer satisfaction scores across all Pinnacle branches. One bar on the graph stood taller than all the others: Westbrook. 6 months ago, this branch had the lowest ratings in our network. Today, it has the highest. Their customer retention is up by 22%. New accounts have increased by 35%, and most importantly, their customers are happy. Eleanor gestured to the side of the stage, where Mrs. Thompson stood waiting. "I'd like to introduce you to the person who made this possible, the same branch manager who once laughed me out of her bank." Mrs. Thompson walked to the center of the stage, looking nothing like the rigid, rule-bound manager from 6 months earlier. She carried herself differently now, confident but approachable, professional but warm. "When Ms. Matthews revealed who she was that day in my branch, I thought my career was over," Mrs. Thompson admitted to the audience. "Instead, she gave me the chance to be part of something better." Mrs. Thompson shared how the branch transformation had changed not just the customer experience, but her own understanding of what banking could be. "I spent 15 years thinking my job was to protect the bank from customers," she said. "Now I understand my job is to help customers feel protected by their bank." As Mrs. Thompson returned to her seat, Eleanor took center stage again. "The lesson from Westbrook isn't just about customer service," she said. "It's about what happens when the system fails its most privileged users, because if it's failing us, imagine how it's failing everyone else." The screen changed again to show plans for a company-wide initiative. Based on what they'd learned at Westbrook, Eleanor's team had developed a new approach to customer experience that would roll out to all 213 branches in the coming year. "Every branch will be redesigned, every policy reviewed, every employee retrained," Eleanor explained. "And here's the most important part. Every branch manager will spend time as a customer in someone else's branch." This announcement caused a stir in the audience. Eleanor smiled. "Yes, that means all of you will take your turn trying to withdraw money, open an account, or apply for a loan. Sometimes you'll identify yourselves, sometimes you won't. But you'll all experience banking from the other side of the counter." As the meeting concluded, Eleanor shared one final update. Robert, the teller who had first helped her at Westbrook, had been promoted to the customer experience team at headquarters. He would help lead the training for other branches, using his first-hand experience with the transformation. "Sometimes the best ideas come from unexpected places," Eleanor said. "Sometimes they come from a branch that seems to be doing everything wrong. And sometimes they come from being told no when you should have been told yes." After the meeting, as people mingled during the reception, an older board member approached Eleanor with a glass of sparkling water in hand. "Quite a story," he said, "but I'm curious, did you plan it this way? Did you go to that branch knowing what would happen?" Eleanor shook her head. "I just needed cash for my sister's birthday present. The lesson was completely unplanned." "The best ones usually are," he nodded. "So tell me, have you tried to withdraw money from Westbrook since then?" Eleanor smiled. "I go in every month just to check, and every time they treat me exactly the same as they treat everyone else." "Which is how?" "Like I'm the most important customer in the world," she replied. "Because to them, every customer is."